Now we're going to be talking about the things that influence our decision making in ethical ways. The three main parts of this are ethical intensity, moral development, and ethical principles.
Magnitude of consequences is the total harm or benefit derived from an ethical decision. The more people who are harmed or the greater the harm to those people, the larger the magnitude of consequences. Social consensus is agreement on whether behavior is bad or good. Probability of effect is the chance that something will happen and then result in harm to others. If we combine these factors, we can see the effect they can have on ethical intensity. For example, if there is clear agreement, social consensus, that a managerial decision or action is certain, probability of effect, to have large negative consequences, magnitude of consequences, in some way, then people will be highly concerned about that managerial decision or action, and ethical intensity will be high. Temporal immediacy is the time between an act and the consequences the act produces. Temporal immediacy is stronger if a manager has to lay off workers next week as opposed to 3 months from now. Proximity of effect is the social, psychological, cultural, or physical distance of a decision maker from those affected by his or her decisions. Thus, proximity of effect is greater for the manager who works with employees who are to be laid off than it is for the higher-ups who ordered the layoffs. Finally, whereas the magnitude of consequences is the total effect across all people, concentration of effect is how much an act affects the average person. Temporarily laying off 100 employees for 10 months without pay has a greater concentration of effect than temporarily laying off 1,000 employees for 1 month. Which of these 6 factors has the most impact on ethical intensity? Studies indicate that managers are much more likely to view decisions as ethical when the magnitude of consequences, total harm, is high and there is a social consensus, agreement, that a behavior or action is bad.
Okay, that last slide, we have to thank Computer Bridget for going over that with you. That was interesting. I like the English accent. It gives it more authority, I think. So here we're looking at Kohlberg's stages of moral development. There are 3 stages. 3 stages. Even though it says there's 6, know that there are only 3. Pre-conventional, conventional, and post-conventional. Pre-conventional, we're worried about avoiding pain or punishment, right? So we're worried about the whip. The second part of that, or then the later part of pre-conventional, we're less worried about punishment and more about doing things that directly advance our wants or needs. This whole stage is a very selfish stage. The second stage is conventional. In this stage, we're wanting to be seen as a good boy or a good girl. We want to look good. And we're looking for cues externally to say, this is what a good boy does, this is what a good girl does. Later on in that stage, we're still looking for external cues about what to do, but we're really looking at the laws and how our society is ordered. So that's our external cues for doing what we think is right or wrong. The last stage is the post-conventional stage of moral development. This is where we have internalized ethical principles, and we use those to solve ethical dilemmas. Some of these could be the social contract. We refuse to do something, or we insist on doing something because as a whole society is better off when the rights of others are not violated. And in the last portion of this last stage of this post-conventional, we're working off of a universal principle. You may or may not do something unethical depending on your principle of right or wrong. If we look at some of the more, what we call ethical people, I'm thinking of Gandhi when he was doing his, and he's the one who came up with this kind of peaceful protest or civil disobedience. We're going to resist the evil of the British rule in a peaceful manner. In fact, we're going to do it, and we're going to break the laws to show them that the laws are unjust. Like one of the laws was that only British citizens or British corporations can make salt. So Gandhi got his press friends together and said, on this date, I'm going to walk to the ocean, and then I'm going to make salt. So he had this procession with his friends and with journalists and everyone, and they walked to the ocean, and he made salt. He says, this is an unjust law, go ahead and arrest me. So we're standing up for what is just. Oh, one more thing. Kant, who is one of our great moral philosophers. Kant's moral rule is don't do anything unless you would want everyone in the world to do the same thing. It goes beyond do unto others as you would have them do unto you. No, just don't do anything unless you would be comfortable with everyone in the world doing that same thing. Now we're getting into the principles of ethical decision making. The first principle, according to the principle of long-term self-interest, you should never take any action that is not in your own or your organization's long-term self-interest. The principle of personal virtue holds that you should never do anything that is not honest, open, and truthful that you would not be glad to see reported in the newspaper or the TV. It's kind of like the TV news test. Would you be comfortable seeing whatever you're doing broadcast on Channel 5 News? The principle of religious injunctions holds that you should never take an action that is unkind or that harms a sense of community, such as the positive feelings that come from working together to accomplish a common accepted goal. According to the principle of government requirements, the law represents the minimal moral standard of society, and you should never take any action that violates the law. So that would mean that you would stop speeding. That was kind of a joke. Okay, the principle of utilitarian benefits states that you should never take an action that does not result in the greater good for society. In short, you should do whatever creates the greatest good for the greatest number. Okay, the principle of individual rights holds that you should never take an action that infringes on others' agreed upon rights. And then finally, under the principle of distributive justice, you should never take any action that harms the least fortunate among us in some way. So if we look at the populace and we say these are the least fortunate, then the principle of distributive justice says, will my action or these actions harm these less fortunates in any way? If it will, then I'm not going to do it. So I'm sitting here thinking about these. I'm kind of contemplating which one do I resonate the most with. I think I really like the principle of personal virtue, that idea, that TV test. Would I be comfortable with this action being broadcast to the world? Would that be something I wouldn't mind? Now that we've looked at what goes into helping us make ethical decisions and what helps us be an ethical person, what influences our ethics, we need to ask the question, well, how do I hire people that have a higher degree of no, that's not it, a higher degree of ethical standards than not? So there's two main kinds of tests that we can use. This overt integrity test, which estimates job applicants' honesty by directly asking them what they think or feel about theft or about punishment of those people who are caught doing unethical behaviors. When I applied to, I think, IFA, I went through an ethical test, an overt ethical test, and they were asking, well, what would you think if somebody stole $5 out of the cash register? What should be done to them, and so forth? Honestly, I think that's the only place that I have interviewed with that had me go through an ethical test or to see what degree my ethics were at. The personality-based integrity test indirectly estimates job applicants' honesty by measuring psychological traits such as dependability and consciousness. So there's two kind of tests. One, they'll know they're being tested on their ethics. The other one is trying to come at it from a different way, so they're not quite sure that they're being tested about their ethical decisions.